come and graze the lecture. Okay. You'll see that the person I'm sitting next to is not Piers Goff. Piers unfortunately called this morning to say that he was unwell. Actually, we had already beforehand added into the morning just as well Jeremy Melvin, who is here and is going to kind of join in the discussion of this morning's topic. So I think we should organize it this way. I'll just go through what I think are a few questions about this session, which in some sense, I suppose, is really about the identity of the AA, or rather the identity of the AA in respect to a number of externalities in which we might want to think about what those externalities are and how we might productively relate to them. But I just first want to introduce Jeremy. Many of you here will kind of know him. Jeremy has been a sort of voice of great intelligence in the architectural scene in London for many, many years. Combining it kind of initially with largely teaching, where he was, I don't know what to call it, a sort of co-conspirator of the much lamented late Cath Schonfield at South Bank University. And he has also been a prolific writer and journalist, and for a while ran the Architectural Foundation at the moment when it still seemed to have a sort of socially progressive kind of role to play. Since then, he has involved himself in really the Royal Academy's kind of take on architecture. It doesn't have a very kind of formal way of dealing with architecture. But Jeremy runs the sort of program that they put on of discussions. And he's been involved in a number of other kind of urban and architectural projects. So it's a very great pleasure to welcome Jeremy this morning. Now, if we could just sort of turn to the questions which we thought might kind of organize the discussion. They really kind of involve something like the following. If we call the AA an international school, I think first of all it repays thought as to what exactly do we mean by an international school. And I think this is a very important question for the AA to consider and think about, because a number of other architectural schools tend often to call themselves international schools. One could think, for example, of the way in which a number of East Coast schools in the States present themselves, in a sense, as being international schools, but really make very little concession to the thought of an international school, in a sense, in terms of their structure, in terms of, in effect, their syllabus, in terms of the architecture which they teach. They remain very fully American schools of architecture who have a high level of foreign students. And I think it's very important to be able to kind of think the nature of an international school kind of beyond that. But at the same time, that then raises the further question, if a school in some sense is international, what is its actual relation to a more local set of references? In this case, what is the relation then of an international school, say the AA, to the city, London? What is the relationship to the local or national architectural culture of the UK? What is actually the relationship between an international school and the practices, in the architectural practices in this city, in which, in one way or another, many students end up, at least for a time, working, either in a year out or in their first years after graduation. So really what we're trying to kind of grasp in this discussion is both the character of an international school and its kind of local roots, its local relations. So having put forward that as a kind of conspectus, perhaps you might turn over those questions in your mind for discussion while I ask Jeremy to kind of come at this question from his own particular point of view.
Well, I think the first comment is that being an international school in London means something quite different to being an international school in New Haven, Connecticut, or Princeton, New Jersey, or something, because those are small communities. Admittedly, they may be very close to much larger communities, but they are still much more tightly defined demographically and geographically than any institution which finds itself anywhere in London. So the nature of an international institution changes depending on, as it were, what its host community is. And of course, in London, London is a amalgam of all sorts of different influences from across the world. I mean, I consider myself a true Londoner because 3 of my grandparents were born not just outside London, but outside the UK, and in 2 cases outside Europe. And I think that's a very common shared experience. So I think that what London is necessarily international. Now, what does that mean for the institution? One is it means that the institution doesn't need to invent itself in the same way that somewhere like Yale has to with its the Louis Kahn Museum of British Art, or the Paul Rudolph School of Architecture, or whatever, that sort of thing. It doesn't need that because that sort of credibility already lies within the constituent strata of what London is. It's a question of finding them rather than having to invent them from scratch. What does this mean about the curriculum? Well, I think this is actually an extremely elusive and interesting and very, very large subject, because one could look at that in all sorts of different ways. One could say, well, if London is so genuinely international, then one can use London itself, but understood in a very broad sense, as the teaching, the subject and object for teaching. One can find communities from almost anywhere in the world in some part of London, and maybe one should actually look at London for all its faults, for all its tensions, for all its weaknesses as well as its strengths, as being in some way a microcosm of the world, of the international community, and that maybe one should look at that, at London, and how London constitutes its internationalism, and somehow use that to inform the internationalism, the international aspect of what the AA is. I think that's too loose and too woolly a concept, and I think one would need to look at it in a more didactic and direct way. But I'm afraid, Mark, I can't say at this point what it would be. But I would say, give it focus, think about this seriously, and give it something, take an intellectually informed decision about it, rather than say, well, let's all enjoy London because it's a multicultural sort of international centre. It is, but that perception is not enough. You have to actively engage with it to take it further. That's the first comments on that.
Okay, well, I mean, do people want to kind of intervene at this point? Should we sort of take it kind of reasonably slowly?
Yeah.
I think first of all, it's helpful within the school to generate what you might call a stronger conception of what it is to be an international school, rather than being, as it were, a kind of London school, which has a lot of students from abroad, what the English used to call abroad. Do people have kind of thoughts on that? Manaz?
I'm very interested in what you just said, but I was just wondering, New York, if you look at New York or Boston, they're very international, they have international communities. They have, I mean, there's even a language barrier. Parts of New York and Boston only speaks Italian or Spanish. And if you speak English, you're a foreigner. And I think it's the same with London now in some areas, although there's a bit of Englishness somewhere. At least I feel it around more.
Yes, but I'm not sure what Englishness is really in this context. Maybe it is just speaking the language.
Well, more than that, I think it's the tea. Everyone starts having tea in the afternoon for some reason. But I was like...
I think they do in Pakistan as well.
But I mean, I'm just interested in this question about being an international school. What exactly do you mean by that? Because I'm unclear. I mean, most schools that I've been to have international faculty, have international student body, have projects that are international.
Yeah.
So, and I do feel this is a elitist school, and I'm very proud to be here. It's a very bad thing to say, but I'm just being honest with you. But, I mean, I don't understand the international context, and what's the difference? And how, I mean, as far as the educational model is concerned, I'm more interested in the architectural educational model, because it's been the most successful in the school, according to everyone I've talked to or read about or critiqued, everything. So I think the focus should have been, I mean, with you, I rather listen to you talk about how is the education, architectural education, very international or acceptable or distinct from every other model that you see.
So how can you make an international model for education, architecture education? Well, can I come at this from the other end, as it were? I think that your comments about Boston and New York are well made, and I know New York not terribly well, but I know it better than Boston, and I would say that it probably has a similar, analogous at least, potential to London to be genuinely international. But what does this mean about a model for education? And I think this is where the particular nature of the Architectural Association is actually so important, because it is a small institution. It is focused around one discipline. In other words, it's not a university. It's not UCL, it's not Columbia or NYU or somewhere. And therefore, it can actually say, well, we're not going to have to look at how a range of subjects fit into this particular local context of one city, but we're going to look at what architecture is in the context of that one city. So I would say that it can only be a model for education, and I'm not going to give you one because I don't have it, but a model for education would have to start off by saying it can only be genuinely international if it has taken informed and resolute decisions or come to some sort of settlement with what its local context is. An international school is not one that is just somewhere existing in the stratosphere. It's international because of the relationship it's constructed to its own roots, its own physical roots.
I think at this point, I mean, it might be helpful to introduce a distinction, which is what one might call the distinction between the international and, on the other hand, the sort of the globalized. Now, obviously, architecture itself has undergone a kind of startling process of globalization at a number of different levels. And amongst those levels really include the way in which, through different media, certain architectures are disseminated. I always remember being amazed, if not a little shocked here, 3 or 4 years ago, when Hugo was introducing the what we called visiting teachers program, in which the AA in the summer invites teachers frequently from, as it were, sort of very far-flung schools, in order that they can come and be with us in the latter part of the summer term to sort of experience the sort of final process of the year in the school. And when he was introducing them, I mean, that year my memory was that there was someone from Uzbekistan and possibly even someone from Mongolia, sort of from the architecture school at Ulaanbaatar. And the question he asked them is, well, you know, what architects are your students interested in? You know, without any hesitation, they said, you know, Zaha Hadid, Peter Eisenman, Danny Liebeskind. Now, that's a sort of process which you can call a certain kind of media globalization. I mean, I'm looking at Wali. I'm sure that's true of far-flung schools in China. You know, that there will be a race to the magazines and whatever. And, you know, it's the same list of, you know, roundup of usual suspects. Now, it seems worth raising that as an issue because that seems to me profoundly different, to some extent even antagonistic, to the notion of what one would call a truly international school, in which, as it were, the question is not initially a sort of guest list from the kind of globalized top 10 of architects, but actually a sort of interpenetration of different national experiences in different ways of formulating problems and different ways of thinking about the kind of solutions. Now, I'm no enthusiast at a kind of theoretical or practical level of Ken Frampton's kind of idea of critical regionalism, but I do think that the questions that he raised in that paper are not only kind of urgent and real, but they are, in a sense, completely real and urgent in an international school. I mean, as I say, I mean, I don't myself buy into his solutions. So could we perhaps, before going back to the local, just see if this distinction between what we might hope an international school would deliver can be clearly defined, distinguished from what I'm calling a sort of the effect of globalization. Because the effect of globalization, almost by definition, is everywhere. Hugo.
I think you're onto something in terms of getting closer to a definition of what the value of being international is. And it certainly isn't a sort of travelling circus. Now let's have the 10 star names from all around the world and therefore we're an international school. It also, I wonder if it's useful to turn it around the other way and say, what would happen if the AA said it was going to define itself as a national school? What would that mean? Is it possible to imagine a school of architecture either trying to or wanting to be national? It seems in the present world to be almost an impossible idea and a very limiting idea. So there's something, perhaps 50 years or 80 years ago, one could have typified the AA much more as being a national school in terms of the people who were studying and teaching here, but certainly as a very international school in terms of the sort of breadth of connections and research and debate that was engaged with. The population of the school was very different then. So that there are significant differences between being international just by counting up the number of students and teachers who come from other countries, and being international in the sense, I think, that you were suggesting it, of having a very serious approach to a comparative way of working, that one locates and develops one's work in a very knowledgeable way in relation to a whole range of other places and other theories and other ideas that do not emerge only from your own culture and only from your own city. On the other hand, you are locating yourself within the city that you're in order to try and test that comparative model. Is there something valuable about trying to do a project in some other part of the world that will have some bearing upon developing ideas for projects elsewhere? or is everything very specific? So in some ways also Frampton's questions in critical realism, I think critical realism are useful, but fairly limited, and I think one wouldn't want to move towards a sort of theoretical, this is what internationalism would involve. But it might be fun to think, could one configure the AA as a purely national school? No, I don't.
I'm not sure it would be fun, Hugo, if I may say.
It probably wouldn't be fun.
Because I think, national schools of architecture to me has a terrible sort of 19th century jingoistic thing. There are national schools of English architecture, and they're Gothic and Gothic and Gothic. I think we could safely leave it immured in history, if you don't mind. I think that how you relate an institution to its particular culture is extremely important. And at one level, some of what it makes an international entity is really quite, functional and prosaic. It is that there are people from across the world. It is that you inherently have that community which can speak for a much broader sense than London, England, UK, Europe, or whatever. But that's mere potential. It's latent until there is some sort of active, didactic, if for want of a better word, intervention into that at an intellectual and theoretical level, I would suggest. And that I think it's really trying to tease out what that could be, or what the starting points for that sort of intellectual process could be.
Could we just think about it in respect to Hugo's question about the national school? Because I think there may be kind of students here who kind of maybe don't know the kind of history of the AA that well. It seems to me clearly that in the post-war period, say from 1945 to, I guess, really till the early 70s, in effect, the AA was functioning as a national school, and in some sense, that could be said to make quite a lot of sense. That is to say, there were seen to be architectural tasks, post-war reconstruction, and architectural commitments, modernism, and as it were, a large public sector to kind of fund that, in which there's a degree of national planning. That is to say, the nation is not just a nation, it was like a unit of systematic national planning. Everything was related to some representation of the national economy. And as it were, it was a point at which architects were strongly and well represented in boards of planning, in drawing up kind of national, regional, local plans. And as it were, there's a whole kind of then a national system which runs from architectural education to the kind of delivery of kind of socially willed architecture. Now, for a number of reasons, that broke down at a national level. And of course, we know it also broke down at the same time almost at the level of the institution of the AA. Now, the sort of phoenix-like kind of coming back to life under Alvin of the AA was clearly premised on at least a fundamental shift in the constituency of students. You could put it crudely. On the one hand, because of the kind of cessation of funded places, or the increasing cessation of that, really, in a sense, the AA increasingly becomes closed to people wishing to kind of train as British architects. At the same time, it opens up to an entirely kind of new, extensive and powerful international body of students. And that indeed has kind of set the institutional conditions for the AA over 35 years. What I think we've somehow lack in that is what you might call a principled rationale for the international. It wasn't too difficult to see what the rationale was. in the period 45-70. It was a sort of combination of modernism, a degree of social idealism, but where that idealism has an immediate practical application, largely through kind of public sector building programs of one kind or another. And therefore it does seem to me that you know, while we kind of try to think out the current identity of the AA, that term, the international, you know, has to be kind of very carefully thought about. Now, one doesn't want to kind of rush to proposals, but it seems to me that on the one hand, Jeremy kind of states one axis on which that lies, which is the absolute importance of London. I mean, where London is, as it were, much more important to us than the UK. You know, when Paul thought last night of one of the possibilities was the AA might move to Birmingham, I sort of don't feel it's going to happen myself. And in any way, sure as hell I'm not going. Be that as it may, so it's like London on the one side and something we might call the international on the other hand. And, you know, that at least seems like the axis along which we might think. In a sense, by taking no serious account of the nation state, may also itself be an advantage, because, as it were, we don't have to entertain fantasies about the nation state based here, one of which continues to be that nation states are settled, they come in a certain kind of, they provide a certain order and organization. It seems to me that from an international point of view, we can actually directly experience those aspects of political crisis or social organization, you know, which are of contemporary relevance internationally, though may not be experienced in kind of great pressure within the UK. One thinks, for example, of the fact that, you know, everyone in Britain always assumes a kind of settled, a sort of rough, settled character to the population. The fact is that the world is in a great migratory convulsion. You know, and just the kind of demography of the world presents us at an international level with forms of instability which architecture has been very kind of slow to kind of respond to.
I think that's partly, if one can take your model of you know, the 45 to 1970 period in Britain at least, where there was a degree of national planning, there was a sense that the country could be made to work as a unit, as a series of rational cogs in a machine, and that broke down. But one of the effects of that, it seems to me, was that thinking about the physical environment, city, building, whatever, was the end result of this machinery. It wasn't thought of as something inherent at all points within that process. The difference, I think, in thinking about a city is a city as the sort of basic entity rather than an abstract national plan as a basic entity, is that you have to deal with the physical environment. You have to deal with, may I say, architecture at all levels, at every point you're thinking about. There is some relationship to architecture. So maybe if we're looking at this axis, which has you know, the importance of your location, London on the one side, and the, you know, international non-locational phenomenon of internationalism on the other, it may be then that where the AA can place itself is, well, where does architecture, understood in a broad and a generous sense, exist on that axis? Because that is where the AA should be. It will always be a school of architecture. It may well do other things as well. It will always be in London. I mean, I didn't know that Paul had floated the idea of going to Birmingham, but it doesn't sound terribly good to me either. So these are sort of given constituent parts. Doesn't mean you can't have a school of architecture in Birmingham, or it doesn't mean that there should only be schools of architecture in London. Doesn't even mean that London has to have a school of architecture. That would be pretty odd, I suspect, if it didn't have, you know, several. But to think about what is the sort of the essence of the AA as an institution. What are the things that are so inherent in its identity that it cannot change? Being in London, being a school of architecture, and I think also I'd have to say being independent of government, and that's the other thing that frees you from this shackle of the nation state. That as soon as you, and it may, probably won't, but just assuming it may come up again that there may be some form of state funding available, that would immediately tie you into the shackle of nation statist thinking. And I think that's one thing that the AA should avoid.
Listening to Jeremy, who has a conservative streak in him somewhere, it's reminded of John Major's definition of Englishness, which you'll remember. The late Prime Minister John Major defined England as a country of deepening shadows on county grounds, warm beer, dog lovers and old maids bicycling to Holy Communion the morning mist. Do you remember that?
No, it's even
that's
song
one
in the
definition of Englishness, which is probably rather, something which is probably rather alien to the AA. But one of the interesting phenomena about the AA, obviously, is the transition from essentially public status to private, which happened remarkably quickly after the, in the 1970s. And that the institution managed to achieve that remarkably without any loss of quality. In fact, the AA is still a leading school in this country. Contrast, for example, the University of Buckingham, another private institution, which I don't think you would say is a leading academic institution in Britain in any respect. The only sort of bad aspect of all this, of course, is the problem which we address constantly at the AA, one of the absence of funding for students in Britain. And one thing the council is addressing forever is the raising of bursary money and endowments, and actually to address this issue, which does lead to a detachment. And I think independence and internationalism can have this sort of negative effect in terms of the institution being seen perhaps as a grand elite institution floating apart from its context. And one issue which I think we should also discuss is the whole relationship between the school and the architectural community more widely. Well, not just the Architecture Foundation, but practices and the world of practice.
I think that's a very good point, Ken, because there is clearly a situation where for a very large number of years, from the 1970s into certainly the late 1980s and into the 1990s, where there were very, very few British students going through the AA. And the people who might have gone to the AA who went to, whatever other school of architecture, generally somewhere else in Britain, are now the people who are beginning to shape practice in as you say, the broader community. Now, and they are the people who one might look to provide some sort of funding. I mean, they're the people who, the broader architectural community is something that could help support the AA. But this is a mutual situation. There needs to be a generosity on both sides. There needs to be an openness. And I think the AA does that extremely well. I mean, I think that the fact that I, as a member of the AA but not a graduate of the AA, can come here to a very wide range of things. I think the programs, the exhibition programs, the lecture programs are extraordinarily good. And I think it's an issue that what impact does this generosity that the AA puts out to the broader architectural community, how could that be reciprocated? And this seems to me to be an issue for discussion, because probably there's no single sort of link that can be made, but there are numerous tiny little ones. Now, I think the unfortunate condition is that many of the AA's graduates who would now be in their 30s and 40s are not in London, because they weren't, they've gone back to wherever they came from in many instances. And so the AA starts with perhaps a slight handicap in that, but I think it's an issue that's well worth addressing.
Could I just intervene on the point that you made? You said at one point, that council have often been concerned with, how could you get more funding for kind of English kind of students. And I'm afraid that, you know, my own view would be absolutely that if we're really genuinely committed to being an international school, while of course we're absolutely committed to raising more funds and bursaries, whatever, to help students in general, it cannot be based on a kind of national privilege that we would do it first for English students. Now, one of the problems, as it were, of the question of funding is, as it were, nothing to do with us at all. It's because of the differential funding in the public sector. Now, it's one thing to say, yes, an English student can go to the Bartlett for 2,700. It's not the same true, you know, to say, looking around the room, someone from Thailand can go to the Bartlett for 2,700. Actually, if you look at the fees being charged to that category, which I find rather offensive, called foreign students in the public sector, you'll see that they're well up there. I mean, you know, 11, 12,000. And why is it that in a kind of rather kind of shameful way, English universities always say, oh, our fees are 2,700, without kind of quite mentioning until you apply from abroad, you know, that they're rather different if you're a foreigner. Now, the AA has absolutely, in my view, correctly always said it would be, from the point of view of an international school, extremely discriminatory. Now, you know, that changes to some extent with the increase of the number of kind of EU students who count as home students in British University. But my point, I think, still kind of remains. Our commitment must be to raising funds and bursaries for all students equally, I mean, whatever their kind of national origins. And I think it would be very much against the spirit of an international school to kind of introduce the kinds of systematic distinctions which the English public sector relies on. Secondly, I think, in a sense, you know, if you look around at a number, say, speaking just about graduate education, for example, you know, while a lot of MAs might be quite sort of well taught in the university sector, and their fees may well be now 12,000 for what they call a foreign student. If you look at what the institution actually provides, I mean, if you look at the kind of richness of experience which the student has over the year, then really coming and doing a graduate course at the AA, as opposed to going somewhere else in London, is extremely good value, and I think is publicly acknowledged to be. So I'm sorry to make such a lengthy intervention, but I mean, it shows precisely that, you know, when we loosely talk about an international school and our support for it, a number of things actually follow from that, quite sort of, you know, quite firmly.
And I think that, you know, the point to turn this on seems to me to be to say that it is fantastically healthy for architectural education in London, for architecture, the architectural community in London, and perhaps for London as a whole, to have an institution that has an equally treated international student body and staff body, for that matter. That somehow having people from various different parts of the world working together, somehow cooperating or thinking about broadly compatible intellectual issues, is something that is of great value to London.
Can we? Sorry, there's a question here. Pedro.
I was thinking in the distinction between internationalization and diversity. I mean, diversity, I mean, if the AA has a huge amount of international students, it would mean that a huge diversity as well should be being here. But it may be hard to say that, for instance, the AA project review is expression of that diversity. Conversely, a sort of process of homogenization, maybe, is in this problem. I mean, I think that maybe the the problem of internationalization is not related with the nationality of the students, but with a process of homogenization of this huge amount of diversity. And therefore, the internationality of the AA is much more related with a process of exporting a certain vision of architecture rather than receiving the different, approaches of the different students, I think.
Well, I'm not sure I can comment on the specifics of how students are taught here, because I have very little experience of that, I'm afraid. I can understand that it may or may not be a problem. I think in any circumstance, the process has to be iterative, but I think primarily an institution has to say this is what we are offering, and if make that coherent, make it sustainable intellectually, make it something that's thought through, but it won't suit everyone. And but I suppose also it has to be something that is capable of adaptation and change. If a new idea happens, then it should respond to that. But it doesn't mean it immediately has to absorb it. There is, I think, potential for a certain amount of creative tension. I think that's quite important, that we are teaching one way, but to acknowledge that there are other ways of teaching as well, and that these are maybe perfectly valid, and they may work better for different situations, different institutions, and serving different communities. So I think that's a very important thing to recognise, but in the end, education is education. It is not all things to all people. There has to be, I think, some intellectually credible didactic programme at some level to it.
Could I just go back to the origins of your point? I mean, again, because I think it bears on the experience of being in what you might call an international institution. And it's this. If you went to a university and read, say, social sciences in Britain, the first thing you would be taught is that all cultures are kind of radically different from each other. Languages are untranslatable into each other. The whole stress is on what you might call the aspect of difference, right? One of the interesting things in an international school, paradoxically, is that people from radically different cultures keep finding a sort of line of sameness kind of running through them, or not quite so great a difference. I think this actually exists even at an architectural level. We had a wonderful Indian student about 5 years ago who gave a delightful paper on the universality of the architectural and interiors taste of the nouveau riche. I mean, she had photographs from China, she had photographs from Hong Kong, she had photographs from the Philippines, India, and the remarkable thing about the nouveau riche, they choose the same ghastly stuff everywhere. It's all chintz. It is now, how anyone could explain, as it were, anthropologically, this identity of taste running through, and I think it's particularly true in China at the moment. Somehow the nouveau riche everywhere. I think the sort of petty bourgeoisie are pretty much the same everywhere. So in a curious way, we keep bumping into these kind of, recognitions of sort of identities rather than kind of differences. I think that the kind of, the standard English social scientist would be rather kind of surprised by, in a sense, the kind of ease of communication. Now, that, of course, does raise the problem at the AA, which is perhaps not wise to go too far into, which is, since we use English as a medium of communication and teaching, to what degree should everyone speak English? But even there, the problem might not be quite what we think it is. I always remember having an enchanting Thai student who seemed incapable of speaking a word of English. And I would kind of rant and rage at him, saying, oh, if only I could understand you if you could speak English. Till finally a Thai student said, we can't understand it in Thai either. I think we've got time for sort of one or two more interventions. Sorry. Nutini.
Involvement between the OU and the AA in the fact of validation. I mean, would the AA be able to validate their own degrees in terms of like graduate school, PhD?
I was so hoping no one would ask that question. I mean, obviously, in a sense, the paradox of our independence is that we do not have the official kind of right to award, as it were, our own, especially kind of graduate degrees, and therefore we have to seek external validation. And there is a price to pay for being validated by the Open University, as there would be for, you know, any kind of system of validation that we had. There's no real alternative unless someone were to, as it were, grant us a royal charter of independence. And it's something that we have to kind of live with, and both the administration and the teachers have to kind of negotiate their way through it. But I think the important point is that whatever differences there might be intellectually between teachers, on this point they would all be united, that they are concerned to negotiate as much freedom as possible. I mean, our discussions with the validating bodies are all to sort of keep the system at bay. Now, it's also, of course, important to take with your question the fact that if you're a public body, even though you have the right to give your own awards, you now, you know, that itself, you know, for a university comes so burdened with research assessment, quality assurance, whatever, that really, in that sense, although universities have the freedom to give their own awards, they have very little freedom because they are tied, you know, by these kind of administrative hoops and forms of assessment in an increasingly destructive kind of pattern.
Your question about your point about funding, Mark, was entirely fair. I mean, it's obviously the need is to raise more money for bursaries internationally, and not, you know, I'm not suggesting purely for sort of British students, but in fact, of course, the simple fact is we're in the middle of a period when many universities are set to go private potentially. You know, within 10 years, UCL, Oxford may be largely private institutions on the American model, and the way the government is taking student funding probably pushes in that direction. Also the dilution of quality in terms of some universities, which are sort of not really universities in the traditional sense. Just a final point on the connections with the profession. I think this is quite important, and you know, I think we should connect more with the world of practice. We've had discussions on the funding level in raising money for sponsorship for lecture programs and other things. You know, discussions with major practices, all of whom want to connect with the AA in terms of, oh yes, we want to find the best students. You know, we'd like to come and recruit. But at least one principal of a major practice, international practice, and not someone who's British actually, I think said to me, well, you know, I always find the AA rather intimidating. I don't know quite where we connect with it. And I find the discussion there rather rarefied. whether that indicates intellectual deficiency on his part or a disconnection with the world of practice on our part. I don't know.
I think if I can make a rather peripheral reaction, but it, I think, ties together both that comment and the previous comment from the floor, which is, I mean, thinking about the origins of the AA, as I understand it, in 1840-something, was because a group of apprentices in architectural practices, and apprenticeship was just about the only way of getting an architecture education at the time, were dissatisfied with the system and banded together and started to organise some sort of teaching for themselves, and that became the Architectural Association. Now, that seems to me to be growing out of a circumstance of the time. I think the PhD thing, it's very interesting. Mark was telling me earlier that you've got the biggest PhD program here, architecture PhD program in the world. That seems to me also to speak of a need that was not being filled by the more formal and conventional and traditional academic institutions, and yet the AA can adapt itself to take that. And now there must be, what was it? How many students do you have? 40 students, 40 PhD students, which is a significant number within the overall student body. And I think it's also, if they're going to be relationships with practice, they should not be forced, but they should grow out of a sort of mutual interest and indeed, to some extent, a mutual hunger, as I suspect the PhD program grew because there was a hunger for a certain or different approach, opening up different approaches to thinking and practicing architecture.
40 was just something I said at a conference recently. I mean, 40 uncompleted ones.
All right, it's a lot of
but I don't approve of hair splitting. Are there any other questions? Okay, well, I mean, it's very difficult to sort of choreograph these things from meeting to meeting into a whole. But I hope in a way that this morning's kind of discussion will do something to help people to focus both on what they mean by the internationalism of the school and what, as it were, the setting of that internationalism is, both in terms of London as a city, London as a particular architectural culture, and in practice. In conclusion, I think one thing that people actually don't reflect sufficiently upon is that when they say we ought to be closer to practices, there is a way in which we've become much closer to practices, but it doesn't seem to have been kind of noticed, which is that if you compare the people, the constituents of people working in those offices 40 years ago with now, there has been an enormous internationalization of the people working in those offices. Much of that internationalization actually comes from the AA. That is to say that the AA, has what you might call unintentionally transformed the interior of quite a number of practices. And that itself is an important connection. Anyway, with that, unless if there are no other questions, I think we should leave it till this evening. And I look forward to meeting people when they come to Jeff Kipnis this evening. Jeremy, thank you very much indeed for coming.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks.